Matt was saying, all the mics are going to should be muted on entry. And if not, please do mute your mic. We're going to record the presentation for today. And so we'll basically run through the presentation. We'll stop the recording. And then at that point, we'll take question and answer where you can, through the course of the presentation, you can either insert your questions via chat or you're also welcome to unmute yourself in the last 15 minutes and ask the questions directly. And please do, as you think about questions through the presentation, please do either write them down or send them in through chat. With that said, I guess, Matt, if you want to start I guess you already started the recording. This webinar is co-hosted and supported by GreenGov Council and Penn State Sustainability Institute. And just a little bit about the GreenGov Council. The GreenGov Council was established by the Governor's Order, Executive Order 2019-01, which requires Commonwealth agencies to lead by example, promoting energy conservation and sustainable governance. The executive order sets goals for the Commonwealth, including the ambitious goal of achieving 26% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2025, and then 80% reduction by 2050. The executive order creates specific goals for agencies, and those goals that agencies are looking to meet over these coming years are based on fleet electrification, high performance buildings. We have a goal of 3% annual energy reductions, and we have a goal to keep renewable electricity in our portfolio. I also wanted to encourage everyone, if you haven't had a chance to visit our GreenGov website, for more information, you can go to www.dgs.pa.gov/GreenGov to see how agencies are meeting each of these goals. We have our 2020 annual report online, and it's a roll-up of the entire program on an annual basis, and you can see the achievements that we've made through this past year. We also have a GreenGov newsletter that we started, and the first edition went out in May, and we're pretty proud of that. So we're going to have a quarterly newsletter and encourage you. There's a place in our GreenGov news section where you can sign up for the newsletter for future newsletter correspondence. And then we also, we also have our third edition or version of the GreenGov agency certification checklist, which is the checklist whereby agencies check their sustainability from one year to the next in various sustainable categories. So with that said, I want to introduce our partner, Peter Boger at Penn State Sustainability Institute. Peter is an assistant director for community engagement at Penn State University and is responsible for developing strategic programming and partnerships that help Penn State leverage its resources to promote sustainability throughout the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And I'll turn it over to Peter now to say more about the Sustainability Institute and introduce the speakers.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. And thank you all. And thank you so much for joining us today and welcome. On behalf of the Sustainability Institute, I want to say how excited we are to have you all here. It's been a real honor and privilege for us to partner with the GreenGov Council on this webinar series for the last year, because we see ourselves as having similar missions. Much as the GreenGov Council is not the owner, but is instead the facilitator of sustainability action within Pennsylvania state government, the Sustainability Institute is a facilitator for all 23 of Penn State's campuses with a mission to try to help the campuses integrate sustainability into their teaching, their research, their student engagement, their community engagement, and their operations. So we see ourselves as having very parallel missions and think that this is a great synergy and partnership to put together this webinar series to try to help build a community both in state government and within our universities around advancing sustainability and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. As Mark said, it's my privilege today to introduce the three speakers for our panel, and I have been privileged to call them friends and colleagues for these last several years. So first off, we have Nyla Holland. Nyla is from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and is a recent graduate from Penn State with a major in political science and African American studies and a minor in education policy studies. And she is now completing a master's degree in education policy. She's been a leader in the Penn State Black Caucus, the NAACP, and Martin Luther King Jr. Commemoration Student Committees. And for the past year, she has been the Sustainability Institute's Environmental Justice Intern. Nebraska Hernandez is from Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and is also a recent graduate from Penn State with a major in geography and a minor in Spanish. He is now pursuing a master's degree in geography. He became interested in environmental justice after seeing the disastrous response to Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. And for the past year, he has also been the Sustainability Institute's Environmental Justice Intern. And finally, my colleague, Dr. Peter Buck, manages academic programming for Penn State Sustainability Institute. He connects faculty, staff, students, and the public to imaginatively integrate sustainability into their work. And previously, Peter was the vice chair and chair of the Ferguson Township Board of Supervisors, the only township in Pennsylvania to have signed the We Are Still In campaign. And currently, he chairs an intergovernmental solar power purchase agreement working group, serves on the executive committee of the Pennsylvania Environmental Resource Consortium, on the National Council on Science and Environment's Advisory Board for Drawdown, and on the board of the Penns Valley Conservation Association. It is my great pleasure and privilege to welcome Peter, Nebraska, and Nyla.
Well, thank you so much, Peter, and thank you to GreenGov Council. I'm honored to be here with Nebraska and Nyla, two young people who inspire me every day that I get to work with them, and I'm eager to share our project with you. Next slide. So we will be sharing about an environmental justice project that we've been working on with an eye on the development of a tool for better education and better decision making. Next slide. So I'll just say a little bit more about the Sustainability Institute. Someone needs to be muted, by the way. I'm hearing a bunch of chatter in the background. And then we'll talk about frameworks for sustainable development and environmental justice, talk about our project, the next steps, and even how you can get more involved. Next slide. So the Sustainability Institute catalyzes work across Penn State. And as Peter Boger just said, we have 23 campuses. We have approximately 100,000 students when you include our 15,000 online students. And so our outreach, educational, and operational work is really quite extensive. It covers a great deal of Pennsylvania and beyond because we are a global university. Some of the projects that we've done over the last few years that could be of interest to people here, or some of you may have shown up to, are, as many of you know, until the state government took on the 191 megawatt solar project, Penn State had the largest solar project in Pennsylvania. We also have students who do outreach programming almost every Friday of the semester to develop sustainability literacy for students, staff, faculty, and the community. We also engage stakeholders from across the state, much as is happening right here, on solutions to climate change. And then finally, the project that we're working on here today, which brings policy relevant, decision-making relevant information into people's hands and minds around issues of environmental justice and sustainability. Next slide. So when we think about sustainability at the Institute, we root this fundamentally in work that has happened at the global and the local level. So in the 1980s, it became very clear to the world and then codified in the Brundtland Report from the United Nations that we needed a new way to think about how to have humanity fit into the patterns of nature. And so sustainable development was codified in that report to be development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. And over time, that has been refined such that at Penn State and in a number of other organizations, people think of it as the simultaneous pursuit of human health and happiness, environmental quality, and economic well-being for current and future generations, Or if you choose to be more philosophical, as John Ehrenfeld, famous designer, said, sustainability is the possibility that humans and all life can flourish on Earth forever. Next slide. So as we think about what that means for us here in Pennsylvania, our group roots the pursuit of sustainability in tandem with the pursuit of environmental justice. And we believe that in Pennsylvania, this is codified in our state constitution in Article 1, Section 27, which says that the people have a right to clean air, pure water, and to the preservation of the natural, scenic, historic, and aesthetic values of the environment. Pennsylvania's public natural resources are the common property of all the people, including generations yet to come. As trustees of the resources, the Commonwealth shall conserve and maintain them for the benefit of, and this is very important, all the people. All the people. So when we look at the history of justice and injustice, of sustainability and unsustainability in Pennsylvania, and we learn, as this article by Marie Cusick reported in State Impact PA, that 1/3 of Pennsylvania's live in environmental justice areas, or perhaps we might want to say environmental injustice areas. What would that look like, and what does that entail? Next slide. So we're trying to think about issues of justice which require participation, meaningful involvement as part of anything that happens. So sustainability is often thought of as just environmental things, only the other or more than human world. And what we're advocating for is to understand that all of human health and well-being has to be understood as integral to the environment and that it requires justice. And I'm going to hand this over to Nyla. Next slide.
Thank you, Peter. So what is environmental justice? So this definition comes from the Environmental Protection Agency. It says that environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, policies, and regulations. And on the next slide, it goes more into what does fair treatment and meaningful involvement mean? So fair treatment means that no group of people should have a disproportionate effect of the negative environmental consequences resulting from industrial, governmental, or commercial operations. And meaningful involvement means that people have the opportunity to participate in these decision-making processes that are affecting their lives and their health. Next slide. So kind of just a quick overview of what how the environmental justice movement came to be. So there's been a history of movements like these having to be born out of exclusion of people of color or low-income folks. So I relate this to the feminist movement, where Black women specifically were excluded from that, so they felt like they needed to make their own movement to address their own needs. And that's a really similar story to the environmental justice movement. The environmental movement focused more on wildlife preservation and didn't focus on the issues that were affecting folks of color and low-income folks. So grassroots activists took this into consideration, wanted to have their needs met in a way that wasn't elitist. So thus this movement was born. And that was through, I guess, after the Black Power movement, so around the 70s, 80s. And in 1991 in Washington, D.C., there was the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit held, and they had delegates from 50 different states, various territories, and they came together to create the principles of environmental justice. Oh wait, also on this slide, it shows Dumpy and Dixie, which is, I believe, the first book written by the father of environmental justice, Robert D. Bullard. And that chronicles his him surveying and observing 5 different locations in the South, Black communities who organized together in order to face the different environmental injustices in their areas. So fighting landfills and toxic waste areas in their spaces. So that, along with other pockets across the country where Black folks and low-income folks were fighting, all of that kind of culminated into this movement and laid the foundation for it. Next slide. So here are just a few of the environmental justice principles. So there are 17 of them, and they kind of cover everything. So they go from affirming the sacredness of Mother Earth. They call for the universal protections from toxic waste, demanding equal participation in that decision-making process I spoke of before, advocating for quality health care, informed consent. It affirms the sovereignty and self-determination for Native peoples. It calls for social justice education. It looks at the responsibility of consumers. So I really encourage you to check out these 17 environmental justice principles, and those are ones that we abide by in the internship and what those who do this work do as well. Next slide. And I'll hand it over to Peter to talk about the color of law.
Yeah, so our work is can't be understood as merely environmental work. It isn't just the preservation of, like, the picture that's behind me of the beautiful Penns Valley. Fundamentally, this comes down to issues of who gets to be involved in what decisions, where they live, who has power, who has authority. And The Color of Law, if you have not read it, is an incredible, detailed, disturbing, and necessary tract on decision making and the exclusion of people of color, primarily Black Americans, from decisions that deeply impact their health, wealth, and well-being. Next slide. And so to go back and think about the Sustainable Development Goals, which have 169 targets and indicators, as we conceived of our project, we want to make sure that we are enabling good health and well-being, that we are reducing inequalities, enabling peace, justice, and strong institutions, and sustainable cities and communities. Next slide. So we can even look at some of the targets that are there. And so these include reducing the number of deaths and illnesses from hazardous chemicals and air, water, and soil pollution and contamination. As Nyla just said, the history of waste siting in America is also, as Robert Bullard would say, not only not in my backyard, NIMBY, but what he calls PIBY, place in Black backyards. So reducing inequalities, ensuring equal opportunity to reduce inequalities of outcome. Peace, justice, and strong institutions ensure responsive, inclusive, participatory, and representative decision-making. And finally, reducing adverse per capita environmental impacts of cities, because a lot of what you'll see in our project has to do with cities in Pennsylvania. Next slide. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Nyla in Nebraska, and they're going to walk you through the project, which is rooted in the principles I just talked about.
Yes, thank you. So I guess just to talk quickly about our internship, about 2 years ago, the SI was encouraged by students to explore environmental justice and to focus on that more deeply. And the SI received funds to award a curricular development grant to faculty members who teach courses on this topic. And also myself in Nebraska, our positions were made at the SI to further environmental justice work at the university. Next slide. So kind of quickly what we do, we work to identify different folks across the university who are doing environmental justice work. So those are different people in the education department, geography department, people in the African American Studies department, all over, and try to connect them to each other, but also to us. We want to engage them and other relevant student organizations, so not just those who work with recycling, but also the Black Caucus and Asian Pacific Islander Caucus and the Latinx Caucus, to engage them in different programming. We brought Dr. Robert Bullard to Penn State, I guess a little over a month ago, to speak to hundreds of people about his work. We work to build those stakeholder connections, and lastly, create this environmental justice map. Next slide. So I will turn it over to Nebraska to talk about the ins and outs of our project.
Thank you, Peter and Nyla. Can you hear me? Okay. So as Nyla said, the mapping project, I'll try to go quickly, but in depth, just so we have time for questions. But essentially, the Environmental Justice Mapping Project takes the 9,740 census block groups of Pennsylvania and puts them into 10 groups of 974, or deciles, to explore various environmental exposures, environmental effects, and sociodemographic information across the state. It utilizes the EPA's EJ Screen dataset and modified methodologies from other EJ mapping projects to create a comprehensive environmental justice map of Pennsylvania. Next slide. So just to give a brief overview of what a census block group is, since everybody in the call might not know what that is, it is a hierarchical census, U.S. Census grouping that's below the census tract, which more people are familiar with. But the census block group is what the EJ Screen data sets data availability is in, and it also gives a more in-depth analysis of the spatial patterns of the indicators that were chosen. So you can kind of think of census block groups as essentially city blocks, if that makes it easier for you. And then next slide. So as I mentioned, this mapping project for Pennsylvania is based off of other states' mapping projects, specifically the California EnviroScreen and the Washington state's environmental health disparity maps. And so the methodologies used for this project are based off of that, and the indicator identifications are based off of that as well. And the Cal EnviroScreen is on the left, the EPA EJ screen is in the middle, and the Washington Environmental Health Disparities Map is on the right. And then next slide. And so these are the 13 indicators that we identified based off of data availability from the EPA's EJ Screen dataset, as well as in collaboration with other stakeholder groups, which may be in this call. If you are, hello, I hope you are doing well. And so since there was a lack of data availability at the census block group for health indicators specifically, such as low birth rates and asthma rates or cancer rates, we didn't include those in our final composite map, but we did include environmental exposures, environmental effects, and sociodemographic factors as subcategories. And all of these have links to health. And so you can think of environmental exposures as how a person comes into contact with an environmental hazard. Examples include breathing air, eating food, or living near to where environmental hazards are released or concentrated. Environmental effects are just adverse environmental quality generally, even when the population contact with an environmental hazard is unknown or uncertain. And then sociodemographic factors are pretty self-explanatory. They are just characteristics of a population across the state. And so these are the 13 indicators that were included in the final composite map. And then next slide. And so for the mapping project, as I said, the indicators were separated into 10 deciles. So there are 974 census block groups per decile. You can read the maps as decile 10, having the 974 census block groups with the highest quantity or value of the indicator, going all the way down to decile 1, which would have the lowest 974 census block groups with the lowest value or concentration of the indicator. So for example, on the left side of the screen, you can see traffic density in Pennsylvania. The highest 974 census block groups in decile 10 would be the darkest hue of blue. And so you can kind of see how roads and highways are made out. You can see, and I'm not good with road names, but I believe, I'm not even going to try. There are roads around Philadelphia, interstates, including I-76, and then offshoots of the Turnpike. And then you can see 81 going from the Maryland border through Harrisburg, and you can also see 83 going from the Maryland state line north towards Harrisburg through York. You can also see just metropolitan areas such as Pittsburgh, Erie, Altoona, Reading, Lancaster, all of these bigger cities having a higher value for traffic density, which obviously carries health impacts due to traffic emissions affecting respiratory just development and health of people. And then for an example of the sociodemographic map on the right, we have racial and ethnic minority distribution in Pennsylvania. And so obviously there are higher concentrations of racial and ethnic minorities in cities. Philadelphia obviously pops out on this map with decile 10 values because there are high levels of Black and Latinx communities as well as Asian communities in Philadelphia. And then kind of just pockets of Black and Latinx people across more rural Pennsylvania in cities like Johnstown, Altoona, Scranton, Allentown, Pittsburgh, and things like that. And so we can go to the next slide. And so for these maps, I changed the color display to show 50% transparency so that we can have kind of a more in-depth look at what's going on in the two biggest metropolitan areas in the Commonwealth. And just a side note, in the final mapping product, essentially, you'll be able to change the transparency for the layers so that you can see a base map underneath versus what was shown on the previous slide. So for an example of environmental exposures, I did talk about that on the previous slide. We can look at traffic density in Philadelphia on the right side of your screen. So decile 10 values, it's interesting because you can immediately make out interstates and just highly traveled roads in Philadelphia. So for example, just Broad Street running from north to south through the city center. We have Interstate 95 going along the outer part of the city along the Delaware River. And then we just have other just highly traveled roads just going throughout the city. And then you can see how different neighborhoods are disproportionately affected by traffic density due to their proximity to interstates. And then on the left side of the screen, you can see traffic density in Pittsburgh. And so it's kind of the same story as with Philadelphia is the decile, the census block groups that have the highest decile value of 10 are the ones with just interstates like 376 going through them. And just to connect this to topics discussed earlier in the presentation, the siting of highways during the construction of just the interstate system, as was detailed in The Color of Law, which, as Peter mentioned, is a great book to read. Just the government in the creation and siting of these roads cited these in Black and Latinx neighborhoods and razed entire neighborhoods to the ground to build these interstates. So we see the disproportionate effects on these communities to this day. And then if you want to go to the next slide, then we have, for example, environmental effects, which is another subcategory. So lead exposure risk in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. So the EJ screen measures lead exposure risk as the percentage of housing units in a census block group that was built before 1960. So when lead paint and lead pipes were the most common to be used. And if you look at Philadelphia, there are disproportionate impacts on North and West Philadelphia compared to the suburbs. And this is because of older housing stock. So you can see that Black and Latinx neighborhoods in North and West Philadelphia are potentially disproportionately impacted due to older housing stock. And then on the left side of the screen, you have Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh also has just older housing units in certain neighborhoods compared to richer neighborhoods downtown. And then next slide. And then finally, racial and ethnic minority distribution in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. On the right side of your screen, you have Philadelphia. So obviously there are Black and Latinx neighborhoods in North and West Philly. And so you can see how these census block groups correspond with the decile 10, which once again, to reemphasize, is the highest value. And an important thing to mention, a lot of people point out in this map, is the gap in North Philly. Right there is a park. And then on the left side, you can also see racial and ethnic minority distribution in Pittsburgh. And so there are Black communities in Pittsburgh. I forget what that neighborhood is called, but you can see just where racial and ethnic minorities are present in the city. Next slide. And so after this slide comes the composite map. So kind of just a brief summary of what the methodology chosen to create this was. We created this composite map based off of the 10th decile, or once again, the 974 census block groups with the highest values for each indicator. So essentially what was done was for each indicator, the highest 970, thank you for the neighborhood names. There's a lot of names floating around in my head right now. But essentially for each indicator, the highest 974 census block groups were given a value of 1, and the rest of the census block groups were given a value of 0. And then we combined all of them, all of the 10th deciles, to create a composite map that highlights the salient locations of environmental injustice in Pennsylvania. Because after looking, and I didn't include the histograms in this presentation for each data or each indicator because I believed it would have been too much, is a lot of the data sets were skewed. So I believed that the census block groups that were in the 10th deciles as outliers really emphasized where environmental injustice and racism were in Pennsylvania. And so on the next map, you're going to see values from 0 to 9. And so a value of 0 means that the census block group had none of the indicators in the 10th decile. And value of 9 means that the census block group had 9 of the indicators within the 10th decile. So this is the environmental impacts and sociodemographic indicators across Pennsylvania, the cumulative toll. And from this, it's kind of hard to distinguish what's going on at a state scale, because a lot of, from this methodology, the environmental impacts and sociodemographic indicators across Pennsylvania are located in cities and metropolitan areas. I would like to mention, just because Pennsylvania is a fracking state and fracking is very important in our policy and environmental justice work, that this mapping product did not include fracking infrastructure in its analysis. But I do want to do that in future iterations of this map, because fracking carries its own health and justice burdens. So just emphasizing that this did not include fracking infrastructure. And that might be why more rural areas in Western and Northern Pennsylvania don't show up as having environmental concerns on this map. But the next slide should show the composite map of indicators in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. And so you can see that certain neighborhoods in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia are really disproportionately impacted, especially in Philadelphia, where several census block groups have an indicator value of 9. And this kind of goes along with what the state already knows, but just re-emphasizes that there are disproportionate environmental impacts on already historically and contemporarily marginalized communities. Next slide. And there are geographical limitations to this. So edge effects focusing on Pennsylvania ignores that concerns might exist adjacent to the state boundaries. Scale, utilizing census block group level data can hide smaller or larger scale patterns. So like I said, using census tract level data might show different things. And temporal, this map focuses on current EJ concerns and doesn't display the historical processes that created these injustices. Next slide. And so looking at the future, we want to incorporate just environmental histories to explain how these environmental injustices formed. So for example, comparing racial and ethnic minority distribution in Philadelphia and lead exposure risk in Philly, you can see how just redlining has disproportionately impacted North and Western Philadelphia to experience older housing stock and just less investment in those communities. So just having that for the state with other indicators as well. Next slide. And then I will hand it back over to Nyla.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. One of our goals with this map is for regular folks to be able to use this, make sense of their realities, and use this as a tool, as well as organizers, but also present this to lawmakers, policymakers, to ensure that the Pennsylvania Constitution is being followed. So to increase accessibility and engagement with this map, we are also going to provide some accompanying material quickly that includes a report of our methodology, our intentions in creating this map, a glossary, so different terms like what do we mean by diesel emissions, why are we including a certain indicator, things like that. Policy histories of Pennsylvania. So if we know that in a certain area there are way less regulations on companies and factories, maybe that can explain why we are seeing the outcomes we are seeing today. If we know that in Philadelphia there's a tree planting program that is only accessible to these certain neighborhoods, that might explain why these folks have disproportionate rates of asthma or stress and things like that. A social media engagement map so people can put in their own pictures of environmental injustices within their areas so we can see it in real time. Also, an environmental justice activity to get people involved on our site. A list of resources to dive more into it. So from journal, academic articles to different documentaries and videos that you can learn more about. And also connecting sustainability and environmental justice. Sustainability is a more popularized term, and there is a definite and distinct connection between the two. So how do we convey that if you care about sustainability, you should care about environmental justice, and really linking those two. Next slide. So everything will be put onto a site. We don't know if it will look exactly like this, but you will be able to see all of that accompanying material as well as the interactive map. Next slide. And kind of some final next steps for us is to make the map interactive, publish it so you're able to access it, continue to present to groups like this. We are working on a permanent position at Penn State so we can continue to update the map, so those future iterations that could include more indicators, having someone working on that, and then continuing to promote awareness and programming around environmental justice. Next slide. So how can you get more involved? You can check out our website. You can read books like the one on the left screen, The Wrong Complexion for Protection by Robert D. Bullard. You can start a book club using that list of resources. You can join community organizations. There's tons of them that work on these same things. And then also 2 of the environmental justice principles quickly talk directly to this. So Principle 5 affirms the fundamental right to political, economic, cultural, and environmental self-determination. And Principle 16 calls for the education of present and future generations with an emphasis on social and environmental issues. So we encourage you to work to include the most silenced voices in the work that you do and all the various spaces that you may be in, to emphasize that crucial part of environmental justice, which makes sure that there is meaningful involvement of all people. And you can also write and speak with your legislators at all levels as well. And I think I'm turning it over to Peter.
All right. So, yeah, we are very happy to take questions, but I want to thank everyone for being here. And I also hope that you'll join me in a round of applause for Nebraska and Nyla, who just do a really incredible amount of work to make sure that people of their generation and the generations that follow are provided fair treatment and equal representation. At the end of the day, if we live in a democracy, then we need to function as if we work in a democracy. And if we want sustainability and an integral environment, then our democracy has to work for that and for all people, particularly now those who have been left out too often deliberately. So at this point, we are happy to take questions, and I know we went a few minutes long. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Nebraska, Nyla, and Peter. This was very informative. I learned a lot. I'm actually looking forward to the website going up, and it's very comprehensive. Matt, are you able to